Hello, and welcome back as we continue in our journey into Phantom. Chapter 3. Looking back, I don't know how I would have managed without Marie and Father Mansart, for I quickly learned what a slender and ethereal thing popularity is. My status in the village evaporated overnight. No one came near my house. It was as though they had painted a red cross on the door, as they did in the old days to warn passerby that those within were contaminated with the plague. Even in this bright new century where science makes leaps with every year that passes, superstitious fears still rule most rural communities like Boscherville. Hearsay tales are inclined to grow out of all proportions, but in this case, imagination and malice might have been hard to embroider the lurid truth. When I finally ventured out in the village, I found myself shunned like a leper. People walked the other way when they saw me approaching, and when I passed by, I would be deeply aware of the nudging and cruel gossip that was taking place in my wake. Father Mansart warned me not to take the child out in the public, and though he did not say so, I knew it was because he feared for our safety. Marie came most days, in spite of the displeasure of her parent in the center of the village. She overcame her own horror and timidity for my sake and taught me the true meaning of friendship. I was now entirely dependent for her companionship and comfort. The expensive cradle lay forlornly in the attic bedroom, whence I had quickly banished it, and for most of the time it was mercifully silent. He never cried unless he was hungry, and that, thank God, wasn't very often. It was though some deep-rooted sense of self-preservation prevented him from seeking any other form of comfort. I suppose my distaste at handling him must have communicated itself to him in his earliest days, and indeed he gave me so little trouble in those first months that I was able to shut him up out of my mind for hours at a time. I never went near him unless I was forced to. I never smiled at him or played with him. I assumed he would be an idiot. It was Marie who hung a string of bells across the cradle out of pity, and one morning she drew me upstairs against my will and made me listen at the open door. "Listen," she said. I heard the familiar random tinkling of bells, the lonely sound of a solitary, neglected baby amusing himself, which I had heard so many times, and from which I had learned in guilty haste. I'm baking," I complained unreasonably. "The cake will burn." "Let it," she said rather shortly. "I want you to hear something. Listen." Surprised by her tone, I did as she asked, and I listened. I became quite aware that the bells were not being struck at random, but deliberately, in a repetitive pattern which formed a short phrase. It had to be a coincidence, a freak chance. But even as I told myself, the phrase shifted, altered, and settled itself into a new pattern, which was repeated without variation several times. "This is no ordinary child," said Marie quietly. "How much longer do you think you can continue to shut him up here, trying to pretend he doesn't exist?" I turned and fled downstairs, slamming the kitchen door shut at the sound of the bells which seemed to follow me. I had not allowed myself to think beyond the possibility of caring for some mindless animal. My child was a hideous monster, and somehow the thought that he might be exceptional in any other way only filled me with terror. If Marie was right, I knew my predicament was going to grow worse. It was not going to be possible to ignore the mind that was developing rapidly behind the little white kid mask. One evening, roughly 6 months after his birth, there was a terrible storm. The wind rattled the glass in the casements and howled down the chimney, making the fire flicker and smoke. Rain pelted madly on the roof. Thunder rolled directly overhead, and each flash of lightning lit the entire room for a split second. I hated to be alone in the storm. I looked for Sasha, who was also terrified of thunder and should, by rights, have been cowering under my skirts by now, but she was not there. The door into the hall was ajar, and I assumed she had gone upstairs to hide under the bed. Suddenly, I heard a great crash from the attic bedroom, the sound of something heavy falling on the floor, and I ran upstairs in alarm. From the doorway of Erik's room, I could see the empty cradle lying on its side in the center of the room, some distance away. The big spaniel apparently wearing a small white bundle. "Stop it, Sasha!" I screamed. "Leave it alone! Sasha! Sasha!" To my astonished belief, the dog trotted obediently to my side and sat down, waving her plumed tail back and forth across the bare floor. I hardly dare look at the bundle. If she had taken him for a rat, I could hardly blame her. As I steeled myself go and pick him up, I realized with a shock there was no need. He was coming to me. I began to back instinctively into the landing, but I was unable to take my eyes off the painful, stubborn, shuffling movement with which he was dragging himself across the room. And then with equal horror, I realized he was not coming for me, but for the dog. Sasha was watching him warily, her head on one side, her ears prickled with curiosity. When he laid hold of one paw with his stick-like fingers, she growled at him deep in her throat, but she did not bare her teeth. I found that I was rooted to the spot, unable to make a move to prevent this from happening. I watched, with frozen fascination, as he pulled himself up in the sitting position, using the animal's fur for leverage, and then stretched out one hand to grope uncertainly toward her face. "Sasha," he said very slowly and distinctively. "Sasha." I took hold of the banister for support. I had to be dreaming this. "Sasha! Sasha! Sasha!" he said repeatedly. The dog pushed her nose into the little white masked face, and I heard the dull thud of his head striking the bare floor when he overbalanced. I cried out sharply, but I was unable to move. I watched the dog paw him gently, and then for the first time, I heard him laugh. 3 months later, he was walking and mimicking my words like a wretched Mayan bird. It was impossible to ignore his presence now. His voice and his interfering hands seemed to be everywhere. And the only respite I knew was those few hours in which he climbed into Sasha's basket and slept curled up beside her. He called me Mama. God knows why, I certainly didn't teach him to. But I'm very much afraid that in those early days he believed the dog was his mother. She seemed to be taking a liking to him, treating him with the sort of rough affection she might have shown a large puppy. Marie told me I should not allow it. She said it wasn't right, that I was raising him to think he was an animal. It keeps him quiet for a few hours, I retorted warily. If you think you can do any better, you can take him home to your mother. That was the end of that conversation. I tried very hard to be reconciled with the situation, for I thought I could not express any physical affection. I was determined to have the satisfaction of educating him. His abnormally accelerated development showed no signs of slowing down. By the age of 4, he was reading the Bible with beautiful clarity and mastering exercises on the violin and piano that I had not attempted before my 8th year. He climbed like a monkey, and there was nothing I could place beyond the reach of his determined hand's reach. He repeatedly dismantled my clocks and threw the most appalling tantrums at his inability to put them back together. He could not bear to be defeated by inanimate objects. So I began to be a little frightened of his awesome progress. I had been uncommonly well educated for a girl. Papa himself had taught me sufficient geometry to comprehend the science on which all architecture is based. But I was beginning to see that Erik would soon be quite beyond me. Figures fascinated him. From the basic principles I taught him, he fashioned calculations that I could not follow. However patiently he explained them to me. He had discovered my father's architectural library and spent many hours poring over the sketches of Longueuil and the Abbé Cornimoy, Blondel, and Duran. And he drew endlessly, obsessively, on any surface that was available. If I could not keep him continually supplied with paper, I would find his designs on the flyleaf of my father's notebooks. On the reverse side was plans, even on the wallpaper on the upside of the stairs. When a pair of needlework scissors disappeared from my work basket, I thought nothing of it, until I found an intricate castle lovingly engraved in the polished mahogany surface on my dining room table. Those scissors did an incredible amount of tasteful wreckage, and though I turned the house upside down and beat him mercilessly in my fury, I was never able to discover where he hid them. But there was mysterious and inexplicable voids. He seemed incapable of distinguishing right and wrong, and though he could draw like a seasoned artist, he could not or would not write. If I put a pen in his hand and told him to copy out a Hail Mary, he being instantly clumsy, as dull and stupid over the simple tasks as the most awkward children. I could not beat him into submission, though I am ashamed to admit I often attempted to do so. He had a will of iron, which I could not bend, and a spectacular temper which frequently reduced me to violence. Exhaustion and fear of doing him a serious injury made me reserve calligraphy as a penance from which he might be released from good behavior. But music was the keystone of his extraordinary genius. Music welled up from some bottomless pool within him and flowed like a ceaseless fountain through his fingertips. Making an instrument of virtually every object that fell into his inventive hands, he could not sit at the table without consciously beating time with his heels against the back of his chair or tapping out a rhythm on his plate with a knife. A slap would check him momentarily, but within a minute his eyes would glaze over as he slipped back into his secret inner world of sound. In the early days, when I sang the old operatic arias to pass the hours of solitude, he would leave whatever he was doing and come sit by the piano in wondering silence. Shortly before he was 5, I allowed to take over the accompaniment for me, and if I failed to master a difficult tonally, he would stop playing and point out the offending note and sing it perfectly pitched with intimidating, dizzying purity of his faultless top register. Already he was beginning to make Mozart looked like a dull plotter by comparison. But all the time that he sat composing haunted refrains or playing the piano with a dexterity beyond his years, I knew that his incredibly fertile mind was plotting fresh, awesome mischief beyond my imagination. See you next time.